Because obviously you pay for what you get in life.
Yeah. Behind this $1 million view is the other Australia, a secret battleground where the first people of Australia fought the invading British. This was their land, which they defended bravely and with ingenuity, but they had no guns and were defeated. In 1838, the Sydney Monitor reported, "It was resolved to exterminate the whole race of blacks in that quarter." And this is how many of the survivors live today. Shouldn't be like this, should it? No. It's a rich country.
With its gardens of blooms and its fair perfumes that greet each sunny morn, Australia's creation, the heart of a nation these days.
Whose Act of Parliament in 1901 became known as the White Australia policy. The doctrine of the equality of man, said Barton, was never intended to apply to those who weren't British and white-skinned. Barton made no mention of a people who had lived here for thousands of years, the longest human presence on Earth. Snowden, for two reasons. One, you're the Minister of Indigenous Health, and two, you've been the representative of some of the poorest, sickest people in Australia for 23 years. Why haven't you fixed it?
What a stupid question. What a stupid question. What a puerile question.
In a country of cenotaphs commemorating foreign wars, not one stands for those who fought and died resisting the invasion of their own country, Australia. Is there any commemoration, remembrance in the museum about the frontier wars, the wars fought against that invasion?
No.
Why is that?
I don't know.
That was a major war, wasn't it?
I don't know.
I mean,
and I know how they suffered, but I really don't know why we don't embrace that history. Maybe we're not overly proud of that history.
Thank you. I was 11 years old, and it was an adventure to sit on the sand dunes and look at the people who lived in shacks, who were meant to be dying off. Aboriginal people were not counted in the census, unlike the sheep. A school textbook explained why. We are civilized, and they are not. Known as the History Wars. Following the election of the Conservative John Howard in the 1990s, a group of academics and commentators claimed there'd been no invasion of Australia, no massacres, no genocide. I think the first Australians have a role in Australia Day. Many of them are rather offended by it.
Are they? Why?
Well, because that's the day 225 years ago that we took their country.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, we all think of them anyway, too. That's why we all celebrate.
Yeah. Do you think they have a special place, though, as it was their country for thousands of years? And
they could have their special place, but now it's everyone's place.
Right. They still live in very poor conditions, most of them.
Well, I suppose that's their fault, eh?
If they're part of our society too, they have to do the same as us and try and help things when they can get work, don't you think? To be one of us. I know it's hard for them because nobody wants to employ them, do they?
They would say it's their country. When you say one of us, they would say, well, maybe it's the other way round.
Yes. Yes, I suppose, yeah, there is that, but
they own
from
the
their
country.
point,
They're the original owners.
We came in with our flag and said, this is ours. I know, that's what makes it hard, doesn't it?
Well, over history, that's always happened, hasn't it?
Yeah,
Whoever
it's
comes
always
in
happened.
takes from the original.
Yeah. This is only through the media that I've heard, where they're drunk and they can't get up and they don't want to help themselves, you know, well, that's no good either, is it? You know, you've got to try and get them sober them up and say, well, you know, you can have a future.
Why are they living in such shocking conditions still there?
Well, I think that's what they want. They get offered a lot of things, but that's what they want.
You think they get offered a lot?
Yes, I've been into Central Australia and all that. And yeah, I think that's just how they like to live.
They like to live in that.
In their own. Yeah.
What about the people whose country it was in the beginning? What about them? They haven't got much to celebrate today, have they?
No, they do.
What?
Because you come to this country, mate, you're a part of this country.
No, they didn't come to this country. They were here to begin with.
They were here to begin with?
They had it for thousands of years.
They're all Australian, mate. Everybody that comes to this country is Australian.
Why do you think they find today a day of mourning, a day of offensive day, because it celebrates the taking of their country?
I do not believe that is an offensive. We are all Australian. And dead set, every single person walking past me right here, everybody.
Yeah.
They're Aussie. Doesn't matter if they're black, white, yellow, blue, green, whatever, man.
Yeah.
They're Aussie. We're all Australian. Are you Australian?
No.
You're not
Irish.
How do you think the first Australians make of today? Because they haven't got a lot to celebrate, have they? The Aboriginal people.
In what way?
Well, 225 years ago, their country was taken from them.
See you later. You're full of shit, mate.
The fact remains that we've never left this country. We have never ceded any part of our country or signed that over to any other foreign settlers. That's Australian. We've never done that. None of our people have ever agreed to say, righto, you can take my country, but in exchange for that, I want some welfare funds. Our people have never been aware of such a transaction. What amazes me is there is not the hatred, because that's beneath our dignity to hate people. We have not got that. We have not got that anger. But as all people have to start thinking about righting the wrong, the awful wrong that continues to happen to us and ours.
This was a holding cell. It was from places like Jay Creek that children were taken in their thousands by police and welfare officials. They became known as the Stolen Generation. The policy was assimilation. It was influenced by the eugenics movement, which had links to fascism. One official famously described it as breeding out the black. It was genocide.
Maybe I have. Why let them take baby away?
Some Aboriginal children were wanted, and white Australians could choose the one they liked. Like the little girl in this photograph, marked with a cross.
My brown skin, baby, they take him away.
Many would become domestic servants in middle-class homes, an undeclared system of slave labour. Did you miss your mother a lot?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Cry nearly every night. We all used to cuddle up each other.
Known as the bungalow, this is where many children were taken from the 1920s to the 1950s, where they were easy prey for sexual predators. Australia's darkest secret is that rape and sexual exploitation were used by whites against black women and children.
White Australia doesn't have a sense of belonging to this land. It only has a sense of belonging to the establishments and its institutions and its cities it's built here. It doesn't understand this country.
Let's rise up to break these chains, stop these killing games.
Australia is the only developed country repeatedly condemned for the abuse of its Indigenous people. Now and then Australian governments talk of reconciliation, an acceptable idea that hasn't built decent homes or got rid of blindness in children and malnutrition and Dickensian diseases. It hasn't stopped young people suiciding, and it hasn't stopped a land grab that began more than 2 centuries ago. Like apartheid South Africa, reconciliation is not possible without justice, and this will only happen when the first Australians are offered a genuine treaty that shares this rich country, its land, its resources and opportunities. The benefit then will be mutual. For until we give back their nationhood, we can never claim our own.
No more whispering in our minds, no more whispering in our hearts. We're gonna rise up to break these chains, stop these killing games.
I wonder if you'd believe this as a solution to the Aboriginal problem. Herd the worst of the Aborigines into one area and put a chemical in their water that sent them sterile. In time, there'd be none of them left. Well, that solution has been put forward by none other than one of the Premier's closest friends, West Australian mining magnate Lang Hancock.
Those that have been assimilated into earning good living or earning wages amongst the civilised areas, that have been accepted into society, and they have accepted society and can handle society, I'd leave them well alone. The ones that are no good to themselves, who can't accept things, the half-caste, and this is where most of the trouble comes, I would dope the water up so that they were sterile and would breed themselves out in the future, and that would solve the problem.
That's what I tried to be, please. Don't poison me, please. You're gonna comply? I'm gonna die. If you fucking swear once more, I'm gonna fucking light you up again. Understand? You're not getting the message, are you? No, I want to do my bone. I don't know.
Right. You're being very silly, mate.
Who was that character? Oh, right.
We rounded people up into our own concentration camps. In fact, what we have done from the original invasion to now is constantly reduce Aboriginal people to a subhuman status.
The policy says you're a black Aboriginal Australian. You're not wanted on this earth.
This is Sydney, jewel of Australia and the good life. I'm on my way to Palm Beach to meet Diana Edwards, who manages holiday homes overlooking the Pacific.
Oh, that's impressive.
Isn't it beautiful? It's like being on a ship.
And all of that is Palm Beach.
Yep,
Yeah.
that is the Pacific Ocean at its best. People sort of are always popping in for drinks. So 2 levels of entertaining, which is fabulous, with a huge big decks.
Yeah. What is this rent for now?
Christmas time, about $30,000 Australian per week.
A week?
Yeah, per week.
That's a lot of money.
It is, but it's the peak time when everybody is here. Absolute paradise found.
I finally found it.
Yeah.
I mean, do people ever say to you, look, $30,000 or $40,000 a week is just too much, or do they say that's fine?
No, because obviously you pay for what you get in life.
Yeah.
Behind this million-dollar view is the other Australia, a secret battleground where the first people of Australia fought the invading British. This was their land, which they defended bravely and with ingenuity, but they had no guns and were defeated. In 1838, the Sydney Monitor reported, "It was resolved to exterminate the whole race of blacks in that quarter." And this is how many of the survivors live today. This is Eric Alkedra, who works at the health centre in the Aboriginal community of Umbludawatch, some 200 miles from Alice Springs in the Northern Territory.
Yeah, I moved in here last year. Other families living in one house, maybe 20 in one house or 15 in another. Some living outside.
Do you have a kitchen in your house?
No.
No kitchen?
Yeah, I have to make a fire outside.
Yeah.
You got a fire there, wood outside.
No electricity?
No electricity, yeah, no.
You got water?
Yeah, I used to tap out here.
And you don't have a shower or anything like that?
No shower.
So it's just that one outside tap?
Yeah.
So to wash the kids, they got to stand under the tap?
Yeah, get a hose.
You hose the kids?
Yeah, hose, put a hose up.
Oh. Shouldn't be like this, should it?
No.
It's a rich country.
Yeah, it's rich.
For some. You have a right to certain things. You're paying your tax.
Yeah, I'm paying my tax. But I'm living in a tin shed.
Here you are living with your family here, without a kitchen, tap outside, no electricity. And just over there, there's what they call a government business manager.
Yeah.
And he's got 18 air conditioners.
Yeah, he should have given me one then.
Like a jewel so rare in a setting that's fair, a city of white was born. With its gardens of blooms and its fair perfumes that greet each sunny morn. Australia's creation, the heart of a nation,
This is Canberra, the capital of Australia. It's very quiet, with wide clean streets, manicured lawns, excellent schools. And this is the Australian Parliament. According to a government survey, it's one of the most advantaged places in one of the wealthiest countries. And this is the suburb of Barton, named after the first Prime Minister of Australia, Edmund Barton, whose Act of Parliament in 1901 became known as the White Australia policy. The doctrine of the equality of man, said Barton, was never intended to apply to those who weren't British and white-skinned. Barton made no mention of a people who had lived here for thousands of years, the longest human presence on Earth. They were deemed barely human, unworthy of recognition in the new suburban utopia. They are Australia's secret. This film is a journey into that secret country, my homeland. It will describe not only the uniqueness of the first Australians, but their trail of tears and betrayal and resistance from one utopia to another. We're We're about 200 miles from Alice Springs and heading into the red heart of Australia. It's a region known as Utopia, called that by the first white people here, who either had a very acute sense of irony or were demented by the fury of the heat. It hasn't rained for months and it's extremely dry. In the survey I mentioned at the beginning of the film, which named Barton in Canberra as the most advantaged place in Australia, the most privileged place, it also named Utopia as the most disadvantaged place, the poorest place in Australia. It's the home of the first Australians. I had arranged to meet David Smith, who runs the clinic in the town of Umblutterwatch. David and his team from the Aboriginal Health Service do their best helping to care for communities across the vastness of Utopia and beyond.
That one's water. Good.
People live here because this has been their homeland for thousands of years, their spiritual and physical home. And yet they are denied the basic facilities that white Australia regards as their right and takes for granted.
We're meant to be doing primary health care when really we haven't got the basic needs of a human being under wraps yet, you know, which is sanitation, water, shelter. They're out here. They've got we don't have public transport, so if you don't have a car, you're trapped out here, so that's impacting as well. There's no bush bus service. The essence of us sharing this planet together and having some equality of life. These toilets being blocked, of course, that's going to have a mass flow-on effect, you know, by cross-contamination with hand washing just in general, you know. And if you haven't got water and you haven't got light, well, what's going on? Mary, I'm just going to show John this toilet here. Is that okay? Just show him what's going on in here. This is an overflow toilet, John, obviously with a lot of rusted out underneath tin there, and obviously it's going to attract snakes and other vermin into here. And this toilet here is obviously a going concern of what's been happening here at at Noongarnapa. We can tell that we don't have a functioning toilet. You would think there would be a basin in here so that kids can wash their hands. We got a mirror so they can check that their eyes, trachoma, you know. We've got ongoing issues, cross-contamination of gastroenteritis, just so many numerous things that this can create. I mean, where do I stop? It's, you know, these are compacting, let alone on the diabetic and the chronic diseases. We know that there's a major problem with diabetes. We know there's a major problem with renal and coronary disease. But what we haven't started addressing is the impacts that low quality housing and poor maintenance and sanitary practice is impacting on in Aboriginal lives.
All this needs
revamping.
It needs pulling down and building again.
Well, it's not a refurbishment, is it?
No.
Right. Do you get a lot of cockroaches and that?
Yeah, cockroaches.
Because they came out and sprayed not that long ago, didn't they? I've had to get them out of their ears. They've crawled into their ears, and I've shown other health workers they didn't believe me. I said, no, you need to have a look at this and look in the ear with a otoscope, and seeing a cockroach with his legs and all intact curled up in an ear, in adults as well as children's ears, in the canal. So I know that they're there, so you can't tell me that there's not cockroaches and there's not a problem.
Talking about ears, do a lot of these children have glue ears, that is, ears that block up?
Otis media is a compounding factor in Indigenous people.
What's the effect of that?
Well, it's a learning process, a delay learning. due to them not hearing correctly.
Can't hear the teacher.
No, that's right. We're going to get a lot of problems. We'll get respiratory normally. We'll get cross contamination, diarrhea, gastroenteritis.
And how does it affect the young children particularly?
Well, hydration levels. You lose. They lose 10% of their body fluids. We've got some serious problems.
These conditions bear a striking similarity to communities I filmed 28 years ago. This is old footage, but it could be today. Across remote black Australia, little seems to have changed. The same shacks, the same lack of basic services, the same diseases, like trachoma that causes blindness and is entirely preventable.
I can't believe that I'm actually in one of the richest countries in the world, and you have people, Aboriginal communities here who are living in conditions which are really almost inhuman.
Aboriginal people are frequently blamed for their poverty, while Australians pretend that governments have tried to invest in these intransigent communities and never got any result. The truth is something else entirely. Governments do not invest in remote Aboriginal communities because if governments do, they know they won't be in government very much longer.
I think it's quite shocking that you can have this level of poverty and this level of lack of basic facilities in one of the richest countries in the world. Australia can easily resolve the problems here. If you take the Utopia community, which is where we are, the homelands here, the total population is only 1,400. If you take the Aboriginal community in the Northern Territories as a whole, you're not talking about more than 50,000 people or so. So to suggest that, after decades we can't solve this problem in a country which is absolutely not short of resources means that the problem is somewhere else.
Mr. Snowden, you've been a member of Parliament for the Northern Territory for a total of 23 years, almost a quarter of a century. A third of the Territory's people are Aboriginal. Why, after all these years, is there unchanging, shocking poverty wherever you look?
A hard question to answer in short. I think there are a combination of issues, one of which is some legacy issues, which revolve around very poor government policy for, 50 years at least.
I mean, I've been making films on Indigenous Australia for as long as you've been a politician. And to be shocked all over again is quite an experience. And what people have told me over the years are sets of excuses.
In the context of health, for which I'm responsible and have been responsible now for a number of years, 3 years, we've made massive interventions which will address many of those issues. We've got significant policies, very good policies, addressing chronic disease management. These policies have been introduced by this government since 2007, and they are making a significant difference.
There was no significant difference for one Aboriginal man who died during the night I was staying in his community. The next morning, his family and his small tin shack were gone. When an Aboriginal person dies, their home dies too.
On the night I was there, a man called Mr. Davey, aged just 47, died of a heart attack in his humpy about 20 metres from the clinic. They couldn't save him with all the equipment they had and all the expertise they had. And it was made clear to me that they couldn't save him because this man probably had, as a child, rheumatic heart disease, which is the highest recorded, has the highest recorded rate in the world.
Which is why we're investing in the primary health care to try and ensure that these young kids, the next generation of kids, don't have their father's problems. And that's what we're doing. And I'm proud of what we're doing.
Well, I'm glad you're proud. I just
couldn't see evidence
Well,
of
did you-
anything
well,
of
did-
in these
Did you talk?
communities.
Well, you talked to the doctors. Ring the doctors up after.
Yes, I've talked to the doctors.
And did they doctors tell
I
you what
talked to one doctor. One doctor I talked to. I didn't expect her to say what she said. But she compared the conditions with 19th century Dickensian England. She said in that time there was rheumatic heart disease.
That's right.
I talked to another doctor who reminded me that Australia is on a United Nations shame list as having not conquered trachoma, which even poor countries like Sri Lanka have conquered.
And did she tell you about the investments we're making in trachoma right now? I'm not proud of the past. I'm certainly not proud of the past.
What about the
But
present?
What I am proud of is...
You're proud of the present?
I'm proud of the fact that we've
How could any Australian, and I'm an
Could you
Australian,
let me
walk
finish?
into those
Could you let me
communities and
finish?
say they're proud?
Could you let me finish? I'm proud of the response this government's made to what is a very poor set of circumstances for Aboriginal people, not only there, but in other communities across this country. And I won't have it from you that we're not committed to making those changes. And I won't have it from you that we're not investing those resources. And you need to know a bit more about me than you currently do, I might say.
Questions, Mr. Snowden, for two reasons. One, you're the Minister of Indigenous Health, and two, you've been the representative of some of the poorest, sickest people in Australia for 23 years. Why haven't you fixed it?
Oh. What a stupid question. What a stupid question. What a puerile question.
Sometimes in my darker moments, I actually think that addressing the Indigenous development problem in Australia is beyond the capacity of Australia, and that we actually need overseas aid in addressing this problem. We need people from outside Australia to come in and tell us, how do we deal with this problem? It's become so politicised and acerbic here that we just cannot deal with it rationally.
To the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, Aboriginal people are represented alongside wild animals, reptiles and birds. In a country of cenotaphs commemorating foreign wars, not one stands for those who fought and died resisting the invasion of their own country, Australia. Is there any commemoration, remembrance in the museum about the frontier wars, the wars fought against that invasion?
No.
Why is that?
I don't know.
That was a major war, wasn't it?
I don't know.
I mean, listening to you, I'm surprised. You have such a very interesting and a very enlightened view, frankly, of so many wars, and yet we have no commemoration.
I served with Indigenous soldiers, and they're wonderful people, and I have great admiration for what they did, and I know how they suffered, but I really don't know why we don't embrace that history. Maybe we're not overly proud of that history.
Thank you. Officialdom in Australia is so sensitive to this truth that I was refused permission to film in this great public place and had to play tourist with it. My first encounter with Aboriginal people was here at La Perouse, overlooking Botany Bay, where Captain Cook landed. I was 11 years old, and it was an adventure to sit on the sand dunes and look at the people who lived in shacks, who were meant to be dying off. Aboriginal people were not counted in the census, unlike the sheep. A school textbook explained why. We are civilized, and they are not. This is a TV documentary from 1962 that captures the mood of the time, as if Aborigines were not Australians at all, an attitude that seems to have barely changed.
Do you regard yourself as dark, and your people as dark people?
Oh yes, my father was a full-blood, and my mother's fair. I take after my mother. But I don't class myself any better or any lower than anybody else. I just class myself on the level of everybody else.
Why do you think that you live the way that you do?
Oh, well, see, this place here, they haven't done it up. They pay rent. People pay rent here. But the places are not up to standard.
Some of them could pass easily for Australians. Few of them care to talk about their disappointments. Have you ever taken any interest in this whole problem yourself?
Yes, before, years ago.
Why did you?
I was fighting for child endowment, bonuses. I'm against the way the papers, they incriminate my people. They bring us down. They don't try to lift us at all. They forget we're human.
Denigrating their humanity was part of an ideological campaign known as the History Wars. Following the election of the Conservative John Howard in the 1990s, a group of academics and commentators claimed there'd been no invasion of Australia, no massacres, no genocide. The arrival of the British was a day of celebration for which the natives should be grateful. They and their culture were all but obsolete, their history worthless. This genocide denial was the propaganda of empire, trying yet again to justify the stealing of land and the banishment of its people. It's Australia Day 2013, celebrating the founding of Australia as a penal colony in 1788. The convicts were the poor British and Irish. For Aborigines, this is Survival Day, a day of mourning.
What's Australia Day mean to you?
Just a big celebration and all our country get all together and celebrate for a good country.
Do you think the first Australians have a role in Australia Day? Many of them are rather offended by it.
Are they? Why?
Well, because that's the day 225 years ago that we took their country.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, we all think of them anyway, too. That's why we all celebrate. Yeah.
Do you think they have a special place, though, as it was their country for thousands of years? And
they could have their special place, but now it's everyone's place.
Right. They still live in very poor conditions, most of them.
Well, I suppose that's their fault, eh?
If they're part of our society too, they have to do the same as us and try and help things when they can, get work, don't you think? To be one of us. I know it's hard for them because nobody wants to employ them, do they?
They would say it's their country. When you say one of us, they would say, well, maybe it's the other way round.
Yes. Yes, there is, I suppose, yeah, there is that
they own
from their
the country.
point.
They're the original owners.
Yeah, we came in with our flag and said, this is ours. I know. That's what makes it hard, doesn't it?
Well, over history, that's always happened, hasn't it?
Yeah,
Whoever
it's
comes
always
in
happened.
takes from the original.
Yeah. This is only through the media that I've heard, where they're drunk and they can't get up and they don't want to help themselves. You know, well, that's no good either, is it? You know, you've got to try and get them sober them up and say, well, you know, you can have a future.
Why are they living in such shocking conditions still?
Well, I think that's what they want. They get offered a lot of things, but that's what they want.
You think they get offered a lot?
Yes, I've been into Central Australia and all that. And yeah, I think that's just how they like to live.
They like to live in that.
In their own. Yeah.
What about the people whose country it was in the beginning? What about them? They haven't got much to celebrate today, have they?
No, they do.
What?
Because you come to this country, mate, you're a part of this country.
No, they didn't come to this country. They were here to begin with.
They were here to begin with?
They had it for thousands of years.
We're all Australian, mate. Everybody that comes to this country is Australian.
Why do you think they find today a day of mourning, a day of offensive day, because it celebrates the taking of their country?
I do not believe that is an offensive. We are all Australian. And dead set, every single person walking past me right here, everybody.
Yeah.
They're Aussie. Doesn't matter if they're black, white, yellow, blue, green, whatever, man.
Yeah.
They're Aussie. We're all Australian. Are you Australian?
No.
You're not?
Irish.
How do you think the first Australians make of today? Because they haven't got a lot to celebrate, have they? The Aboriginal people.
In what way?
Well, 225 years ago, their country was taken from them.
See you later. You're full of shit, mate.
The fact remains that we've never left this country. We have never ceded any part of our country or signed that over to any other foreign settlers. That's Australian. We've never done that. None of our people have ever agreed to say, righto, you can take my country, but in exchange for that, I want some welfare funds. Our people have never been aware of such a transaction. What amazes me is there is not the hatred, because that's beneath our dignity to hate people. We have not got that. We have not got that anger. But as all people have to start thinking about righting the wrong, the awful wrong that continues to happen to us and ours.
The early birding traffic takes the narrowest bridge to Perth, while down the Swan at Applecross the boats lie at their berth.
This was the official 1960s vision of a suburban utopia in Australia's biggest and richest state, but it was dependent on airbrushing out an entire human community.
Ah, this is better than life for me. A day by the beach in the open sea.
Rottnest Express is the smoothest, fastest ferry service travelling to Rottnest Island. Rottnest Island is Western Australia's idyllic island getaway.
I'm travelling to Rottnest Island from Perth. Tourists call it Rotto. From 1838, it was a brutal prison that ought to be as notorious as Robben Island in South Africa. With me are Marion Mackay and Noel Nannup, two members of the indigenous Noongar nation. They know the truth about this island. When I asked Marianne to accompany me, she was fearful, until Noel offered to protect her from the sense of horror and injustice that awaited us. Rottnest Island was one of the British Empire's most isolated concentration camps, part of a genocidal history that's barely recognised in white Australia. On the beach, Noel performs a ceremony meant to protect us all.
So, if you scoop up a bit of sand, and then it's the gnarly waga, like your body odour, will be on the sand, and when you throw it out there, the spirit here will know that you're here. Wara wearing bolyakangan. Pabradan, murit jinjin, ngaladat nyining.
On the ferry over, I just picked this up.
Yep.
And here it is, Rottnest Island.
Yes.
And naively, I was waiting for a description in the historical section of something.
Yeah.
Not the horrors, but even a sanitised version of the concentration camp that was here. There isn't anything.
No.
Historic Rottnest, here it is. Play and stay.
Enjoy the unique wonder of Rottnest Island and the harmonious surroundings of the Rottnest Lodge. Daily ferries and organised flights can whisk you away to this paradise in just 30 minutes.
This was a prison known as the Quad. Thousands of Aboriginal men and boys were incarcerated here, many of them tortured and killed. Today, it's a hotel with a luxury spa.
Australia must be, Noel, the only country that makes a tourist hotel out of a place of carnage. I can't think of another one. They're the obvious comparisons. But this is...
I know what
shocking,
you're saying.
isn't it?
It's so degrading. We feel so, so traumatised about all of this. And you could imagine 7 people living, trying to be crammed into each cell. There's 3 cells here.
And the kind of conditions that they were living in?
The conditions they lived in initially when this was first built, they only had one vent above the door. That was it. And it gets really cold here and it gets really hot here.
This is obviously a family room. This is where the children go. They've got double bunks and parents there.
And you know, this room we're in is actually 3 rooms. In each cell, there's 3 of them here.
So 9.
17 people died in each cell.
17 people.
So in this expanse, you can see from that wall over there to there, 51 people have died.
And this is what people now pay $240 a night. Yes, that's what it costs. We rented this room to do this interview.
Wow.
$240.
Unbelievable. And they don't have any idea what happened in here. No one tells them. No one lets them know. And I tell you what, if it was me, I would want to know what happened in the room that I sleep in. Just outside that window, that door, they built a gallows. They hung a Gascoigne man there. And the other prisoners that came down with him had never seen someone hung. And they were subjected to being lined up each side of the gallows. And the prisoners built the gallows that had already been here, and they watched as that man was hung. The impact it had on them, they were just stunned, and for days and days they were just mourning and wouldn't eat. So that's ticking over as well as what happened here. And you know, these people coming in here and staying here, this is what Aboriginal people are subjected to in Australia, the lucky country. I mean, lucky for who? Certainly not us. We're refugees in our own country.
Next to the hotel is one of Australia's largest mass graves. Over 300 Aboriginal prisoners are buried here. Until a few years ago, there was no sign indicating this was sacred ground. What was once the morgue is now the hotel kitchen. The manager of the hotel told me there were long-term plans to convert the Quad prison to a memorial.
You see the burial ground and they just got no respect at all for the history of our people. Have all them unmarked graves with a sign talking about the place, but then you got a road right between it where the car can drive through and people can just walk and desecrate the areas of our ancestors' remains.
Rottnest Island is not the past. Western Australia is a state of imprisonment for black Australians. On Australia Day 2008, an Aboriginal man called Mr. Ward died a terrible death as he was driven 300 miles in this prison van in blazing heat. The temperature in the mobile cell reached 56 degrees centigrade. The coroner called it a disgrace. The Director of Public Prosecutions took 2 years before deciding to do nothing. Eventually, the van drivers, their employers, and the Prisons Department were fined for a breach of health and safety regulations. An Aboriginal man called Mr. Ward suffered a really terrible death. The coroner said, in effect, he cooked to death. The coroner also said that your department, when you were minister, shared the responsibility for his death.
I certainly contemplated resignation after it happened, because what's the point in Parliament if you can't change things for the better?
Well, the Aboriginal legal services, they routinely warned you as minister.
Yes.
So you couldn't say you didn't know?
No, I knew, and in fact I can recall writing a lengthy letter to the Aboriginal Legal Service. I did so on the basis that the bureaucrat gave me assurances that they would lift their game.
This was an especially horrific death. A man cooked to death. He was so hot that there was a terrible burn across his body, and he died.
Yeah.
Where does the buck stop?
Ultimately, you're right. The buck stops with me. The whole justice system is to some extent at fault. Now, as I said, I'm not evading my role, because I regard myself as, at some level, being personally responsible.
You were in charge of the department.
Yes, I agree entirely, and it's something that I'll go to my grave regretting intensely.
Why didn't you resign?
Why didn't I resign? I contemplated it for 3 days.
What happened?
And then I thought, well, I really want to see if I can, do whatever I can to fix the issue.
But what did you do to fix it?
What I did was, we already had, for example, other transport, better style vehicles on order. And so there are things like that need changing.
But that doesn't happen to white people, does it?
No, of course not.
When was the last time a government minister in Australia resigned and said, we can't take this kind of atrocious racism? It seems that we're waiting for the next case to happen.
I had to put my staff through cultural sensitivity training.
Cultural sensitivity training?
No, but my staff in my office, on the pretext so that I could then invite the senior people from corrective services along, in the hope that they suddenly understood some of these fundamental issues.
What's cultural sensitivity training?
Well, about our Aboriginal culture, what the issues were from a corrective services perspective. So I've subjected my staff, who I thought were excellent in my ministerial office, to this training on the pretext that I could get some of the senior managers in from the department to actually learn some basic facts about Aboriginal culture.
So they didn't know any history. They didn't know that massacres took place across this country. They didn't know that people had been sent to a form of Devil's Island.
Well, certainly some of them did. There are some very well-meaning people who do all know that, but some of the senior management, and in fact one of the senior managers, who's a female, she was asked when she joined the department here in an interview in the departmental magazine, what exposure she had to Aboriginal culture. She said she'd come from Bradford and dealt with a lot of Pakistanis, so she understood these issues.
How was she planning to deal with Aborigines in Australia?
Well, I just had no idea. It was shortly after that I arranged the training session.
You arranged the cultural sensitivity training?
Yeah.
Is Western Australia building more prisons?
At the moment, they're, I think, racking and stacking them is the vernacular.
Excuse me, what does racking and stacking
Well,
mean?
they're double bunking. So it literally is warehousing people, I think.
They're warehousing and
Yeah.
racking and stacking.
Yeah.
That's the way they filled up the slave ships.
That is what they're doing, John. They are racking and stacking. They've just built the 14th prison, adult prison, and they've lauded it. It's been applauded by a lot of people. It's up in Derby, and it's an Aboriginal prison.
So it's going to be mostly Aboriginal?
No, it's going to be all Aboriginal, from less than 3% of the population.
This whole notion of the law and order state, increasingly looking, as some argue, to have, a centaur state that looks after very well those who conform and fit in to, in terms of, neoliberal global values, and incarcerates and treats very harshly those who don't conform. And I think what we see in Australia is not just a punishing of the poor, but punishing of the Indigenous different. These are people who have fundamentally different norms, and they're very susceptible to not conforming to the norms of the law and order state, which again, some argue is a direct product of global neoliberalism.
This man had committed no crime. He was drunk and seriously ill. The police call this protective custody.
My nephew was taken into custody, I think it's on the 3rd of January. The police have this sort of thing where they can grab people off the street who they believe need protection.
The quicker you get up there, the quicker you get on the rest and get out.
They took him into the lockup for protective custody. And the only person he needed protecting from was them.
Sit down, mate. Sit down, mate. Stop being silly, man. All right? Or I will drag you down to the cell. Just stay there, mate. Sit down, mate. Right? You're being very silly, mate. All right?
Not a glamorous job.
Aged 27, this man is dying in his cell, alone and helpless. His name was Mr. Briscoe. He died from intoxication, asphyxia, and his treatment by the police, who ignored cries to help him. The coroner said they could have saved his life. No one was prosecuted.
He was just left in his cell to die while police officers surfed the net.
Here where we are in the Northern Territory, the rate of incarceration was 6 times that of the incarceration of black people during the last 10 years of apartheid in South Africa. In Western Australia, it's apparently 8 times more. Do you think Australia should be regarded as an apartheid state?
I don't think it's a lot different, apart from the fact that there aren't signs everywhere saying, black people drink from this tap and white people drink from that tap. In Alice Springs alone, you would have to be blind not to see apartheid here.
The amount of people taken into protective custody is staggering. And the recent death in custody coronial in Alice Springs, I can't remember the figures, but even after 25 years in the Northern Territory, I was staggered that I needed that many people go into our custody. The evidence is in all our jails, particularly in the Northern Territory, full to bursting, and it's not going to change anytime soon. We really need to deal with the the underlying problems. And again, it's easy for me to say because I don't have the answer, but we've spoken about it. Giving people good housing, giving people a good education, making sure people's health is looked after as well as mine and everybody else's in the community.
In 1981, Eddie Murray died in police custody in the New South Wales town of Wee Waa. In spite of evidence of police lying and cover-up, no one was prosecuted. A second inquest found that his sternum had been smashed. For more than 25 years, I followed and filmed a campaign for justice by Eddie's parents, Arthur and Leela Murray. I filmed this interview with them in 1987.
Well, in my own mind, I know Eddie, he wouldn't have taken his life. I think he was killed by a police officer.
In 2012, Arthur and I went back to Wee Waa, where his family had grown up and where Eddie had been killed. Arthur Murray's life and extraordinary achievements are almost unknown in white Australia. Arthur worked as a chipper weeding the cotton fields. He was paid just over $1 an hour. Paying black Australians a pittance has a long history in the land of fair go.
It was hard too because we had planes flying over top us when we were working on pesticides. Once they sprayed the cotton, they spray you too. We had to work under those conditions until we put a stop to it.
Arthur Murray and the cotton chippers went on strike, and hundreds of them marched through the town.
We wanted better working conditions, better living conditions, and higher wages. I arranged to have the Aboriginal people stop work, not to go onto a cotton field.
Was everyone unanimous on that?
They all agreed. We stopped work and we demonstrated.
The local newspaper called them communist troublemakers. Arthur was the best kind of trouble. The cotton chippers won an historic victory.
So we won a battle of three. And those three was just...
You won higher wages.
Living conditions.
The council allowed you to camp here.
Camp here.
Yeah.
So our demands were met.
But the Murray family paid a price. They were harassed and often attacked by whites, leading to the violent death of Eddie.
The white people from the other end didn't think it was right for us to live here, so they just come and intimidate us and harass us.
What are your feelings coming back to Wee Waa, Arthur?
John, it's hard to come back to this place. It's a sense of, John, of losing a boy. You know, people like myself and other people that fought for Aboriginal people and fought for their rights and fought for better conditions, fought for what we feel that is right. Hasn't changed one bit, and I doubt whether it will change. You keep asking yourself that. You keep asking yourself the question over and over. Are we going to find justice? Are we going to find the people that recognise that we exist here in this country? One rule for the whites and one rule for the blacks, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, the Royal Commission said that the police committed perjury, that they'd falsified their records, that they'd lied. How many prosecutions were there?
Nil.
The Royal Commission came up with how many recommendations in the end?
339 recommendations they've came up with, and there is still nothing's been done, and there are still people dying in police and prison custody. The day I walked up those steps and through that front door, and I was asked to go upstairs, and to be told that he was dead, I couldn't believe it. I still don't believe it.
How do you feel after all these years? What do you want to happen, Leela?
I want the state government to have a look at it, you know, see if we can get some answers from them. For what they took away from us. Our son. I've suffered a lot, you know, over the years. I don't think I'd take any more. We need answers, John.
When do you think things will ever change in this country?
When we get justice for it, you know, this country.
Leela died in 2004, still fighting for justice.
Every time you come here, is it sadness and anger or?
Well, John, it's both. The sadness and also anger. And it's hard to talk about it, but
yeah,
I've got to express my feelings about a son that I loved, and I express my anger about how he died and under those circumstances, and those angers are still with me.
It's almost impossible to say that Eddie didn't die in vain, because it began a campaign on behalf of so many others, which your T-shirt says, and it's the recognition of that by white Australia that can only redeem, if that's possible, white Australia from its own role in the deaths of young men like Eddie. Recognition of it, and that means justice, doesn't it?
For sure it means justice. And this happened in 1981, and it's 2012, and we are still waiting for the white man to give us justice. And it has to come yet.
This is Leela's grave.
Yeah. All she felt, John, was pain and sorrow, and she thought maybe one day that we'll get justice, but that has failed us, failed her, failed the family.
How old were you when you met, you two?
I was 15, Leela was 17. She's 2 years older than me.
Yeah.
We've been together for 47 years together.
And you brought up a family of 12 children together.
9 girls, 3 boys, yeah. A great lady, a great woman.
Yeah.
I can't say anything better than that she was a classy and lovely lady.
Arthur Murray's heroic stand for the cotton workers is part of a hidden history of Aboriginal resistance. Epic victories by stockmen, farm workers and their families ended slave labour in Australia. At Wave Hill in the Northern Territory, an historic strike by the Gurindji people became a rallying cry for justice for all black Australians.
This movement, this strike, was the longest strike in Australia's history.
Yeah.
It's 8 years. And they were threatened by police and others who worked on the station. They made a stand against this. And this is one of the most historical movements in this country.
Wave Hill was the largest cattle station in the world, owned by the British multimillionaire Lord Vestey. Aboriginal people were the backbone of the cattle industry, yet they worked for little or no money and rations. In 1966, led by Vincent Lingiari, the workers and their families walked off. Their defiance is expressed by their union organiser, Dexter Daniels.
We want the money now.
You want the money now?
Yes. Too long to wait.
So you want to break the law, in effect?
That's right.
You think you get all the Aborigines on your side?
Yes.
In all the Northern Territory?
That's right. I will. I'll do all I can. Every way I can. I'll bring them in my ways.
Their strike was a victory for the principle of equal pay and decent working and living conditions. The struggle for land rights is at the heart of the continuing struggle for freedom in Australia. Black Australians have won limited land rights and a native title law, but this often gives preference to the institutions of white power, resulting in bitter divisive battles for sacred land and the wealth beneath it. The sacred heart of Aboriginal Australia is Uluru. Where tourists can enjoy the good life for more than $2,000 a night, it's eco-sensitive and out of sight of the poverty and slums of those whose land this is. The people of Mutijulu are the custodians of the rock. Their overcrowded houses are riddled with asbestos, which causes cancer. Since 2008, the government has built fewer than 1,000 new houses for Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory.
This is my daughter's house, Mary. She lives here with extended family group. And 32 people are now living in this one
32
house.
people.
See, the community condemned that house there because the asbestos was all broken.
Yeah.
And it was painted over, it was broken, so it's going to cause health problems in the future.
And so you've had a lot of that pressure, haven't you?
Yes.
Of people having to move from condemned houses into houses like this one. So they've done audits of all of Mutijulu, the whole community. They've found asbestos in 70% of the buildings.
Yeah.
They've identified it like this.
Yes.
And yet they've allowed people to go on living in it.
Yes, because obviously we've got nowhere else to live. We do not. And my main concern, because we've got little kiddies that in this come through, is at the moment we're in dire straits. You know, you sleep end to end and end and end, like we done as kids.
There's the bathroom.
Yeah, bathroom and the toilet. With so many people living in here.
You can't renovate an asbestos house. It's got to come down.
So there's 20 people living in a house with one toilet, and every time more people come to stay, the sewer floods. You know, there's raw sewage in the backyard. So you're talking about strongyloides. Sometimes I wonder if I should be testing people for cholera. I'm looking out for it.
Has this house had any money at all from the Housing Authority to renovate it?
We've got not 1 cent to repair our houses. The repairs what we do here, we go to the local rubbish dump and we recycle whatever we can.
Yeah.
That's the way that we have to survive here.
A lot of young children are here too, aren't they?
Well, majority of the household are primary school children.
Primary school children. So that in this kind of overcrowding,
that cross-infection that all children are prone to is going to be rampant.
70% hearing impairment amongst the little ones. That's not on.
70%?
This is 70%.
Ear infection.
Yes, yes.
And so they're partly deaf.
They're partly deaf, yes, they are. My daughter here, who owns this house, is deaf. How ironic that my daughter has to put up an asbestos house with 32 people in Australians. This is why we say an abuse of human rights, Australians.
Yeah. There was a report by the Indigenous Doctors Association that mentioned the incidence and degree of malnutrition, starvation.
Oh, absolutely. Malnourished children. People who are overweight, who are still malnourished because they're living basically on flour and meat, which is subsidised by the council here. Some of the money that comes to the community through the tourism venture is used to subsidise the cost of meat, so people get enough protein. But they don't get enough vitamins because they don't get fruit and vegetables because they're too expensive.
How many people would have to sleep in this bed?
Well, if you can double up the kids, head to foot, head to foot, head to foot, probably about 8 or 9.
8 or 9 kids in one
then
bed.
you've got another mattress with about 3 or 4 will sleep in the single bed.
But you've had report after report by the government saying that the biggest single cause of poverty among Aboriginal people is housing. Following his apology, Kevin Rudd promised, in fact allotted $700 million to building houses in Indigenous communities. Where is it?
They had 9 brand new vehicles with 11 people in the 9 vehicles.
These are the housing people. They came and audited the community.
But not once, 7 times, and still the housing condition is still like this. We also have extra people living
outside
here.
So a family be sleeping.
Family be sleeping there.
Well, I feel sometimes like I'm dealing with similar conditions to the English working class in the 1870s or the 1780s, for example, where you had 20 people in a room and an open sewer in the middle of the court and people dealing with terrible infectious diseases that killed them early and addictive behaviours from the dispossession that the English working class went through at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
In 2007, Prime Minister John Howard and his Minister Mal Brough declared a state of emergency in the Northern Territory, but they applied it only to black Australians.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr Brough and I have called this news conference to announce a number of major measures to deal with what we can only describe as a national emergency in relation to the abuse of children in Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory.
Known as the intervention, its aim, they said, was to save Aboriginal children from pedophiles, but there was a hidden agenda.
It is interventionist. It does push aside the role of the Territory to some degree. I accept that, but what matters more? The constitutional niceties or the care and protection of young children?
The intervention was launched on a very cynical big lie, a vicious one that smeared all Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory because the Minister for Indigenous Affairs at the time, Mal Brough, said there were pedophile rings in all of these communities that the federal government was going to occupy. An extraordinary sweeping claim. The legislation that delivered the intervention, this federal takeover, doesn't actually mention children, but the propaganda machine from the beginning was relentless.
Everybody in those communities knows who runs the pedophile rings. They know who brings in the petrol. They know who sell the ganja. They need to be taken out of the community and dealt with.
An extraordinary sweeping claim. If we are going to be saving the children, we couldn't have any of the recommendations about talking to the Aboriginal organisations or consulting Aboriginal people or even asking the Aboriginal families, well, what is the status of these children? It was time to send in the troops.
They scared the living daylights out of everybody. It really did. The mothers thought their children was going to be taken away, and they bolted. Everybody left this community.
So the army just rolled in their trucks and pitched their tents in the middle of the community.
Yes, here, right
The Australian Army in an Australian Aboriginal community.
Yes, all these soldiers. We were being attacked.
For the first time in modern Australia, the army was sent into black communities as the spearhead of a government determined to control people's lives and their land. Fear and shock overwhelmed communities. People who refused to hand over the lease of their lands were to be denied basic services like decent housing and sanitation. A government jobs scheme that employed thousands in remote areas was all but eliminated. Benefits and pensions were restricted, and people could only buy essentials with a special basics card. Only black citizens were treated this way. As people's incomes were quarantined, starvation was reported. The government's own review committee found what it called a collective despair among Aboriginal people. The rate of self-harm and attempted suicide quadrupled. Laying the ground for the intervention was a lurid media campaign led by a national TV program called Lateline. Lateline claimed that Aboriginal children were the victims of sex slavery. The programme's allegations centred on the community of Mutijulu. A key witness was this man, whose identity was disguised. They called him a former youth worker.
The people who are in control are the drug dealers and the petrol warlords and the pedophiles.
There was no sex slavery, no petrol warlords, no pedophile rings. The anonymous witness was actually a senior government official who had worked in Mutijulu but never lived there. The Lateline program was exposed by investigative journalist Chris Graham, founder of the National Indigenous Times.
In 2006, Lateline began reporting that sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities was rampant and that Aboriginal men were violent and beating and abusing women and children on a scale that can't be believed. And it was that style of extraordinary sensationalist reporting that paved the way for the federal government to introduce policies that, frankly, Australians haven't seen.
I mean, the anonymous youth worker, in fact, was this government official called Gregory Andrews. And he claimed that he'd actually lived there for 7 months.
He hadn't lived there a single night. He'd never stayed overnight in Mutijulu in his life.
I've been told by a number of people of men in the region who go to other communities and get young girls and bring them back to their community and keep them there as sex slaves.
The funniest thing was seeing Greg Andrews, or seeing this man in a hat and a jumper that I knew was his hat and his jumper, and seeing him sitting there talking in this robotic voice about stuff that he'd known about this community or seemingly known about this community. And I'm sitting there watching going, is that Greg? And it was.
And who did you know Greg to be?
So Greg Andrews was my boss in the Office of Indigenous Policy Coordination. He was the Assistant Secretary, the branch manager.
So he was a senior government official?
Yes, yes.
He made all sorts of bizarre claims. He made a claim that he knew of, or he had heard of, children being held in communities against their will and traded amongst communities by Aboriginal men as sex slaves. He claimed that he'd seen women coming to meetings with broken arms and screwdrivers and other implements hanging out of their legs.
Was there any substance at all in any of these claims?
Zero. I mean, none at all.
I asked the man in the hat, Gregory Andrews, for an interview, but he declined.
The Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Mal Brough, looking at the evidence, quote unquote, that the program had produced about so-called paedophile rings, said that child abuse was happening in unthinkable numbers. Extraordinary thing to say, wasn't it?
Extraordinary, particularly in the context that he knew the anonymous former youth worker on the ABC program was actually his advisor.
To me, that was indicative of a complete lack of good faith in the production of the program, because if they couldn't get someone more objective than that, it must, to those who were making the program, have made them at least think that there was a possible problem, more than a possible problem, and yet they just went ahead with it.
The Australian Crime Commission, which you set up and gave special powers to, found no evidence. The Northern Territory Police found no evidence. Umpteen reports since then, frankly, have found no evidence.
Well, that
I'll reel them off to you if you'd like.
Feel free. Factually incorrect. So what they have found is that
the Australian Crime Commission were lying? The Northern Territory Police had got it wrong? Is that it?
The reality is that when they went into these communities, they couldn't find the people that would substantiate the evidence. They will tell you that there is any amount of inescapable evidence, such as STD of children at a very young age, and I have personally spoken to parents and relatives who can identify the individuals, but they won't.
You accused Aboriginal communities, and all Aboriginal communities, not just Mutijulu, of harbouring paedophile rings.
First of all, there was an independent report inquiry put together by the Northern Territory Labor Government. They visited 45 distinct separate Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, and they found evidence of child sexual abuse in every single community.
Mr. Brough totally, completely misrepresented little children as sacred and used it in a very crude way to his own ends. Why would the minister want to say such a thing? Because it's just not true. I don't understand. The report did not point to pedophiles or pedophile rings or, dozens of people roaming around sort of abusing children. It wasn't that kind of report at all. We wrote what people told us about and all the concerns that they have. So they spoke to us about poverty, they spoke to us about kids not going to school, young mothers, a lack of education for everybody, lack of housing, unemployment. When certain conditions like that exist, the likelihood of the abuse of children happening, it's very likely.
The neglect and abuse of children is undeniable. Those facts were lost. The importance of the propaganda by the television programs was to create a situation in which the government could act to control those communities.
You put up pretty provocative signs in these prescribed Aboriginal areas. Would you put up the same signs here on the Gold Coast in Queensland? Would you put those signs up in places where there is child abuse? Middle class Australia, working class Australia, white Australia?
It's a really good question, because what you're actually pointing to is that we should not discriminate about colour, but we should be actually protecting children, regardless of where they are.
Yes.
Let me tell you, I live here on the Sunshine Coast, and there is child sexual abuse here. That's quite okay. And right here, there is no doubt child sexual abuse. It's not exclusive right of one particular ethnicity or one location.
So in 2008, the Central Australian group of specialists put together a report around the intervention. And I suppose one of the major things that we found and we wanted to make clear to the government was that after 11,000 health checks of children that had been performed, there was only one child who was found with a health condition that wasn't otherwise known. And that wasn't a sexual assault case. So if Mal Brough wants to dismiss this report written by experts in their field working on the ground, then I suppose he can, but his dismissal is false.
Why did Gregory Andrews appear anonymously? This is a man who, in effect, worked for you. Why did he appear on the ABC's Late Line programme calling himself, or them calling him, an anonymous youth worker? Why did that happen?
I don't know why you would put the question to me, because
didn't he brief you before that?
No.
He didn't brief you?
No.
The parliamentary record tells a different story. Brough told Parliament that Gregory Andrews provided the information of his notes to my office. Now, the programme used footage showing Aboriginal children sniffing petrol, didn't it?
It did. They weren't from Mutijulu. The petrol sniffing footage came from a community called Docker River, which is hundreds of kilometres away. It's like,
but it was represented as from Mutijulu. Members of the Mutijulu community complained to the ABC about the programme. An inquiry confirmed that footage claiming to be from Mutijulu had come from elsewhere. Disguising a government official as a youth worker was called unfortunate, but justified because he said he feared for his safety. The complaint was rejected. The ABC declined my offer to be interviewed for this film. The people of Mutijulu and others complained to the ABC, and an internal inquiry of a kind was held,
yes,
and which announced that the programme was exonerated. What's your view of the process that exonerated the programme?
Well, I think it's farcical, really. It's a bit like the police investigating their own behaviour. It may be a perfectly proper process internally to do that, but then to rely on it as exonerating the programme makers seems to me to be going a step much too far.
When this was exposed, did you get an apology from the ABC?
We had no warning, no apology, nothing, and I think we left hanging in the air as though we're still guilty.
One of the facts that saddened the members of the Mutijulu community was a failure of the media to recognise that the extremely lurid allegations that had been made against them were false, and were found to be false by the Australian Crime Commission. No one ever took the time to clear the name and the reputation of the Mutijulu community.
Again, I say, the Australian Crime Commission, which you gave special powers to, investigated and found no evidence.
It is just simply incorrect.
And he completely annihilated us in what he did. That intervention was completely, disgustingly wrong.
I certainly accept that the intervention was wrong-headed, was stupid. I said it at the time. I maintain that point of view.
It was based on a deception, wasn't it?
Well, more than that. It was based on a lie.
Good. What was the lie?
Well, the lie was that basically, to cut it short, that Aboriginal men were basically all child molesters.
Aboriginal men, I think, are the most demonised people in Australia. And I'm constantly saddened by that, because that's my father, that's, you know, my elders, that's, you know, Aboriginal men I deal with every single day. It saddens me that they're painted as these rapists and people who can't control themselves. I think that's just absolutely disgusting, and it shows that these people who write these things don't know the Aboriginal men I know. They obviously haven't spent a lot of time with Aboriginal people in communities. I think that's what really saddens me, because it affects Aboriginal women as well, because that's our husbands, that's our sons, that's our uncles. It's really disgusting, and it is a myth. It's not true.
I mean, we've got a lot of racist policies in our past, but this one was the mother of them all. And in order to launch that policy, the federal government, with the assistance of the opposition, the Labor Party at the time, suspended the Racial Discrimination Act in order to bring it in. And there is only one reason why you suspend a Racial Discrimination Act, and that is if you intend to do something that's racist. And both parties admitted it was racist. The United Nations has branded it racist, but they did it anyway.
I'm damn sure if, say, South Africa had proposed to introduce similar legislation there would have been absolute outrage in the rest of the world. And yet here in Australia we can do it, get away with it, and nobody seems to think that there's anything inherently wrong with it. That's the bit I don't get.
What is the point of imposing something like this on you?
I find it extremely suspicious that, I remember a few years before the intervention was placed in Central Australia, watching huge helicopters fly over our homeland with these massive, big, I don't know what they were, I can only assume they were looking for minerals. And they just fly over. It was like watching a film from outer space, these helicopters flying over with these big, massive antenna-like things hanging from them. Then, a few years later, the government comes, crashing into the Mutijulu community to sort of obliterate these pedophilia rings that actually weren't there. And then they bring in the intervention, and then amazingly, they find this huge amount of uranium and precious soils in Central Australia. And it all coincides around the same time. And people might think I'm being a bit paranoid, but you can't help but be paranoid when all of those dots are sort of connecting to each other.
In 2007, a campaign called Top End Secret 2 was launched by the Northern Territory government to explore for new mineral deposits. According to an industry survey, the Northern Territory is the new frontier of Australian mining. It was here, in Jay Creek, that one journey ended for me and another began. It was 1969. My newspaper in London had sent me back to discover my own country. How ironic. And I was in for a shock. This was a photograph I took at the time. Jay Creek was secret Australia. A government reserve where people were forced to live in unimaginable conditions. This was a holding cell. It was from places like Jay Creek that children were taken in their thousands by police and welfare officials. They became known as the Stolen Generation. The policy was assimilation. It was influenced by the eugenics movement, which had links to fascism. One official famously described it as breeding out the black. It was genocide.
My brown skin him away. Between her sobs I heard her say, policemen taking my baby away. From white men, boss, that baby I have. Why let them take baby away?
Some Aboriginal children were wanted, and white Australians could choose the one they liked. Like the little girl in this photograph, marked with a cross.
My brown skin baby, they take him away.
Many would become domestic servants in middle-class homes, an undeclared system of slave labour. Lorna Fijo and her childhood friends would hide in fear of being taken away.
And I said, be careful, they're taking brown-skinned babies away from their mothers, black mothers. I have a black mother. So we used to go and we made a cubby house down the creek. We dug a hole. And we used to practice and we used to run down, put, one Aboriginal boy was cockatoo, what they call cockatoo. He had to watch out. And he had to cover us up with leaves from the gum trees. And sure enough, one day the horses came galloping and we ran down and we hid there. We hid down in that creek and that Aboriginal boy was putting all the leaves over us as if nothing happened. And they cracked the stock whip around him. And he was frightened. He got panicking. He ran back to this camp and the welfare men found us and took us, and mothers were screaming and crying and hanging onto the truck when they drove us away.
Oh.
Yeah.
Your mother must have been...
She fretted for me to the day she died.
Did you miss your mother a lot?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Cry nearly every night. We all used to cuddle up each other.
Oh. Known as the bungalow, this is where many children were taken from the 1920s to the 1950s, where they were easy prey for sexual predators. Australia's darkest secret is that rape and sexual exploitation were used by whites against black women and children. Today, when Aboriginal people set this history against the false claims that led to the intervention, the irony is bitter.
The time has now come for the nation to turn a new page. A new page in Australia's history by righting the wrongs of the past and so moving forward with confidence to the future. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians.
It was not an apology on the murder, the rapes, the poisoning and everything of Aboriginal Australia, or the First Nations as people prefer to be known now. It was an apology for stealing so many of our kids with the same intention of assimilating them and making sure there is no continuity of Aboriginal traditional practices in Australia.
Mr. Rudd, as Prime Minister, you broke a long silence in Australia. You apologised to the Aboriginal people for the theft of their children. You said, and I quote, "It's not sentiment that makes history, it's our actions that make history." What did you mean exactly?
I think with the apology, two things were necessary. One was a deeply, if you like, spiritual or emotional transaction between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. And that was simply but profoundly to say sorry. It may sound trite to some. I've heard it described as gesture politics. But if you have deeply wronged a people or deeply wronged a person in your own life, you cannot begin to conduct a normal relationship until you've set wrongs to rights at that level.
But the wrongs did continue. Within a year of Rudd's apology, 37 Aboriginal children were taken from their families, allegedly for neglect, in the town of Lightning Ridge, New South Wales.
There was a little baby, 4 days old. They just went to the hospital and just ripped him out of your mother's arms. That's going back in history. This is what was done with our little stolen generation children.
A 3-year campaign by the families in Lightning Ridge saw almost all their children returned, but they're the lucky ones. All over Australia, black children are being taken from their homes. Many are given to whites and lose all contact with their Aboriginal families. This is a new stolen generation.
It was actually only a fortnight ago I received a call from community members who are in distress who said that the police and the Child Protection Agency had actually turned up at a family's house in the morning while the family was having breakfast, barged into the house, taken a 3-year-old child, put it in a car and driven it 700 kilometres away from that community. The grandmother who was in that house was wailing, chasing the car, throwing rocks at the car, and couldn't believe, was saying over and over again that this is what was done to us before, when the stolen generation was at its height. This is happening again. In the north of Queensland, almost 200 babies were removed from their mothers in the hospital. Often hours after giving birth, these babies are removed by the Child Protection Services. No explanation about the process, why this has happened, what their rights are, how they might be able to contest this, what they might be able to do. Left crying for their children.
The author of this report, Olga Havnen, was sacked by the Northern Territory government following its publication. The report revealed that in 1 year, the government spent almost $80 million on surveillance and removing children, compared with just $500,000 on supporting these impoverished families.
So $80 million a year in actually what is called child protection, but these are the people who take children away.
That's right.
Take children away on the assumption that there is child abuse across the Aboriginal community. In fact, your report shows that the Northern Territory, where the government aimed its guns and described, as the Minister did, child abuse in unthinkable numbers, is among the lowest in Australia.
That's correct. It's pretty sobering, and I think the other thing...
That's more than sobering. That's, with all respect, that's a major deception. Talking to people, they told me how much they appreciated your apology, but almost to a man and woman, they said nothing had changed. In fact, many of them had said the situation was worse.
I am not going to stand up here and sort of wave some flag and say, guess what? It's all fine and dandy and we fixed it. I'm not into that.
Look,
To quote the great Australian prophets, that's bullshit.
Okay. It seems to me that the good news might also fall into the category of bullshit. Why did you say immediately, I think after the apology, and you were very emphatic about this, in fact your words were, I want to be blunt about this, there'll be no compensation.
On the question of compensation for injuries suffered directly, what I've said also to Aboriginal leaders is that I don't rule that out at all as a Member of Parliament. I just don't.
Aboriginal people once more had their expectations raised, but what followed was treachery. That's the constant pattern of black and white relations in Australia. Raise the expectation and then betray that trust with treachery.
This betrayal runs deep in Australian political life, with its connections to powerful interests such as the mining industry.
The Australian mining sector is enormously profitable. It makes profits of around $1 billion a week. It makes profits of just under $52 billion a year, and it's a vast amount of money. And what you basically have is large companies making massive profits from minerals that they didn't make on land that they don't own. And that's called smart economics. That's called 21st century Australian economic development.
In the 1980s, the Labor Party pledged national land rights to the Aboriginal people. They call this Australia's greatest moral cause. The mining lobby went on the attack with propaganda like this.
Through Aboriginal land claims, your right of access to up to 50% of Western Australia could be taken away. Do you think it's fair that less than 3% of our population should claim ownership of up to 50% of our land?
Full-page newspaper ads. You thought it was your home. Think again. Targeting iconic places in Australia. A beautiful picture of a beautiful place. Have you loved this? Take a good look now. Your kids mightn't get a chance to. Aboriginal people will lock it up. White people won't be able to go there. You'll need permits to go to your favourite beach. You won't be able to swim or fish at your favourite beach because the blacks will take it. It was extraordinary. It was bald, crude, and sadly effective.
Once elected, the government of Bob Hawke gave in. Universal land rights were abandoned. In 2010, the mining industry spent $22 million on a campaign to stop a proposed tax on their super profits.
What do all those who love Western Australia say? Axe that tax! Axe the tax! Axe the tax! And bugger off! Please listen. What should our West Australian newspaper be saying? Axe the tax! Axe the tax!
The campaign succeeded. Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard reduced the tax to almost nothing. The revenue lost is estimated at $60 billion, enough to fund land rights and to end Aboriginal poverty. This is Robert Eggington, a warrior of the Noongar people of Western Australia, whose resistance defies a history of dispossession. Here he speaks uncompromisingly to a white audience.
I've experienced dark sarcasm and racism from authorities since my early school years to my adulthood. I don't believe in nationalism. It's offensive, and it gives a false sense of identity of those who have stolen lands of which they now believe that they so rightfully inherit.
Robert has pursued those who denigrate and exploit Aboriginal people. At a remarkable healing centre in Perth called Dumbartung, Robert and his wife Selina celebrate Aboriginal culture and history. And here they battle a modern disease called suicide. They lost their own son Bob this way.
I would say that within the last
last 2 weeks here in Perth, we would have suffered and we would have experienced 7 to 8 suicides, ranging from young children as young as 14, 15 years of age. The history of colonisation and what's led up to this epidemic today is reflective of the policies of the governments, and in particular the stolen generations. Certainly incarceration and the continued incarceration of young Aboriginal men would be a key factor. And I think with a lot of young Aboriginal men, the loss of identity, culture and their heritage plays a key role in the sense of where their self-worth is diminished and their value in a society that doesn't value their culture or them as even human beings.
For a lot of our young people, they don't see any hope at the end, or any light at the end of the tunnel, or any hope within their future. And so for many of them, the answer is not to want to be here anymore.
Robert and Selina have made this a memorial room and covered it with photographs of Aboriginal people and their families, all touched by lives cut short.
All of the people to whom come here to, be able to emotionally feel a sense of connection and belonging. They're able to and have a place where they can just literally cry here.
There's another photograph here of our grandson. He's a very spirited little boy. He lost his dad 4 years ago through suicide, and this very room here is a memorial, is a tribute to his dad, our only son. It was like when our son died, all our hopes and dreams died with him. But that's not the case, because here is our beautiful little boy, and this is where we see our hopes and dreams now with our little grandson, as well as the other 2 grandchildren that we have.
We believe that when comes our time to pass on, we go back to the earth and we become part of that earth again. So the cycles of humanity and earth become one, and we're not separated. So if you've got a belief system, let's say like a Western belief system, you're going to be saved outside of this world in a place called heaven. Well, of course, you can do with this land as you like. You can plunder it, pillage it, rape it and destroy it. It is of no consequence. But in our culture and in our laws, if we were to harm the land and to hurt that land the way in which it's being done today, we would be punished spiritually very severely for that. White Australia doesn't have a sense of belonging to this land. It only has a sense of belonging to the establishments and its institutions and its cities that's built here. It doesn't understand this country.
No more whispering in our mind. No more whispering in our hearts. Let's rise up to break these chains. Stop these killing games. One less loved one at Christmas. One less loved one on birthdays. But that smile won't be forgotten. Can you never fade away?
In other Western countries, Indigenous people still suffer. But unlike Australia, historical treaties have been signed that begin to recognise their right to self-determination. Australia is the only developed country repeatedly condemned for the abuse of its Indigenous people. Now and then Australian governments talk of reconciliation, an acceptable idea that hasn't built decent homes or got rid of blindness in children and malnutrition and Dickensian diseases. It hasn't stopped young people suiciding, and it hasn't stopped a land grab that began more than 2 centuries ago. Like apartheid South Africa, reconciliation is not possible without justice, and this will only happen when the first Australians are offered a genuine treaty that shares this rich country, its land, its resources and opportunities. the benefit then will be mutual. For until we give back their nationhood, we can never claim our own.
No more whispering in our minds. No more whispering in our hearts. We're gonna rise up to break these chains, stop these killing games.